The metallic clanking of the prison doors had long been a familiar sound to Thaddeus Montrose, marking the beginning of a new, faceless day at the Vineyard Correctional Facility. 3 years of incarceration had taught him the value of small islands of control in an ocean of unfreedom. His cell, a gray box 3 by 2 meters, was divided into functional areas with the pedantry of a military man: a sleeping area, a makeshift gym, a place to read. Thaddeus rose from his hard bunk 5 minutes before official rising. It was a habit left over from his military service: always be 1 step ahead, always have the advantage. He sank to the floor and began his daily routine: 100 push-ups, 100 squats, then another 100 push-ups at a brisk pace. His muscular body, covered in droplets of sweat, strained in a methodical rhythm. "You and your fucking exercise, Thad," Leroy muttered to his cellmate, pulling the blanket over his head. "Let me sleep, man." Thaddeus ignored Leroy's displeasure. To him, these workouts weren't just a way to stay in shape. It was an act of resistance, an assertion that a part of his soul still belonged to him alone. After morning roll call and a meager breakfast, oatmeal, almost tasteless but caloric, Thaddeus went to the prison yard, where he spent another hour lifting improvised weights, water-filled plastic bottles, and sacks of books tied to a broomstick. Other inmates long ago nicknamed him the Machine, so methodical and intense were his workouts. "Montrose is training for the Olympics?" grinned one of the guards, watching Thaddeus. "No, he's just crazy," the other replied. "Marine Corps, what can you take from him?" That evening after supper, when most of the prisoners had gathered in the common room to watch the basketball game, Leroy sat down with Thaddeus in the corner of the mess hall. "I got something for you," he said quietly, looking around. "From my girl. She knows you're Kelsey." Thaddeus's heart skipped a beat. His wife's name always gave him a mixture of longing and hope. They'd been married a year before the bar incident that had cost him his freedom. A stupid fight with a guy who'd been loose with his hands and didn't understand the meaning of the word no when talking to Kelsey. 1 punch and he fell, hitting his head on the edge of the bar. Death came instantly. Thaddeus didn't mean to kill, but his military training had played against him in court. Leroy held out a quadruple folded piece of paper. Thaddeus unfolded it and felt the ground go from under his feet. In the printed photograph, Kelsey stood huddled against a tall man in an expensive suit. Her eyes shone with that special light that was once reserved for him. In the next picture, they were kissing outside a restaurant. "That's Javon Price," Leroy explained, noticing the whitening of Thaddeus's knuckles. "He owns several fancy restaurants in Fargo. He and your wife have been together for about 5 months, according to Shaniqua. Live in his house in the suburbs." Thaddeus was silent, studying the face of the man who had stolen from him the last thing of value left in his life. Javon looked confident, successful, pleased with himself. The complete opposite of a prisoner with an uncertain future. "She filed for divorce 2 weeks ago," Leroy added, holding out another document. "Here's the notice. It'll come officially in a couple days, but Shanika works at the law office that handles it." Something snapped in Thaddeus at that moment. He'd always thought Kelsey was waiting for him. Her letters, infrequent but warm, had kept that illusion alive. Now he realized that for the past few months, she'd simply been hesitant to tell the truth. Maybe out of pity, maybe out of fear. It didn't matter. The result had been the same: betrayal. That night, sleep did not come. Thaddeus lay on the hard bunk, staring up at the ceiling, where cracks in the concrete formed patterns he had already memorized during his 3 years of confinement. The silence of the night was broken only by Leroy's snoring and the distant jingling of the guard's keys as he made his rounds. Thoughts circled in Thaddeus's head, like vultures over a dying man in the desert. A picture of Kelsey and Javon popped up in front of his eyes every time he tried to shut them out. He saw their smiles, their closeness, their future, all the things that should have belonged to him. Rage, hot and blinding, rose from the depths of his soul, replaced then by icy despair. Toward morning, The decision came, sudden and crystal clear. He had to get out of here. Must find Kelsey. Must meet Javon. What would happen next? He didn't know yet. But he knew he would only stay here in this cage if he was shot while trying to escape. Over the next 3 days, Thaddeus became more observant than ever. Every Thursday, their crew of 12 men were taken to outside work, clearing the timberline along Highway 16. They were guarded by only 2 overseers, Williams and Peterson. Williams, a heavyset man of pre-retirement age, was usually seated in the shade with a thermos of coffee, only occasionally taking his eyes off his smartphone. Peterson, younger and more alert, had only one predictable flaw. Every 2 hours he retreated behind the trees for a cigarette. On Thursday, dressed in his work uniform and given his tools, Thaddeus held his breath as the van pulled out of the prison gates. The muscles beneath the orange uniform tensed as if before a fight. He knew there would only be one chance. They were brought to an area where a patch of woods came right up to the road, jeopardizing visibility for drivers. The prisoners spread out around the perimeter, cutting branches and picking up debris. Thaddeus had deliberately chosen a spot on the far edge of the lot, closest to the dense forest. Glancing at the watch on Peterson's arm, he noted the time, 11:45. At noon, the young guard usually left for a smoke break. The sun was scorching mercilessly. Sweat dripped down Thaddeus's face as he worked methodically with the pruning shears, trimming branches overhanging the road. Outwardly, he was calm, but inside, tension was building. Every few minutes, he let his gaze slide around the perimeter, estimating distances, memorizing the location of the other prisoners, calculating the guards' viewing angles. At 11:58, Peterson yawned, stretched, and headed for the edge of the woods where he usually smoked. At the same time, Williams, sweltering in the heat, covered his eyes as he sat in the shade of the patrol car. Thaddeus took a deep breath. It was now or never. He moved deliberately leisurely to the edge of the work area, as if picking up cut branches. His heart was pounding so hard that it sounded like it was going to echo throughout the forest. With his side vision, he caught a glimpse of movement. Peterson had disappeared behind the trees. Williams was still dozing. Another step. One more. And now he stood at the very edge, beyond which the dense forest began. A second of indecision, all his past life, and what might be ahead, flashed through his mind. Then a spurt. He dropped his tools and ran. Without looking back, without thinking of anything except that every meter, every step separated him from the cage in which he had spent the last 3 years. Branches whipped at his face, roots tried to trap his feet, but Thaddeus was as if possessed. 6 years in the Marines and 3 years of daily training had made his body the perfect tool for this crazy run. Somewhere behind him, Williams shouted, "Stop! I'll shoot!" Then a warning shot, the sound of which dissolved into the noise of the woods. Thaddeus did not stop, did not slacken his pace. He knew that Williams, with his size, could not catch up with him, and Peterson had not yet realized what was happening. The forest grew thicker and thicker. Thaddeus ran until his lungs began to burn with fire and his legs began to shake. Only then did he allow himself to stop, leaning against the trunk of a huge pine tree. His heart was pounding in his throat, black dots dancing before his eyes. But he was free. The barking of dogs could be heard in the distance. The chase was on. Thaddeus knew he had at most an hour's head start. He listened to his internal compass and moved on, now at a brisk pace, saving his strength. When he reached a small creek, he followed the water downstream, taking care not to leave any tracks. It was a tactic he remembered from his special training in the Marines. Tearing a flap from his prison robe, he tied it to a tree branch on the opposite bank from his route, hoping to confuse the search dogs. By nightfall, Thaddeus had traveled what he estimated to be at least 15 kilometers. He found shelter under a fallen tree, digging a shallow hole among the roots. For the first time in 3 years, there was an open sky above his head, studded with stars. But there was no time to savor the freedom. Cold and hunger quickly reminded him of harsh reality. Lying in his primitive shelter, he pulled a crumpled photograph of Kelsey and Javon from his pocket, the only thing he'd taken with him from prison. In the faint moonlight, their faces seemed ghostly, almost unreal, but the rage they evoked was more than real. The next day brought new trials. Thaddeus realized that in his prison robe, he would be conspicuous even in the dense forest. He needed civilian clothes, food, water, maybe a map, all of which meant taking a risk and getting closer to the men. By noon, he came to a small road and followed it with caution, keeping in the shade of the trees. Soon, a lonely farmhouse with an extensive garden where laundry was drying on a rope came into view. Thaddeus lurked in the bushes, watching the house for about an hour. He saw an elderly couple get into an old pickup truck and drive off down the road, leaving the house empty. With his heart pounding, he crossed the open space between the woods and the house. Quickly removing his jeans, shirt, and baseball cap from the rope, he just as quickly disappeared back into the woods. Thaddeus felt a little more confident now that he had changed his clothes. He could pass for a tourist or a local, at least from a distance. Daringly, he walked back to the house and slipped into the barn, where he found an old backpack, a folding knife, and a few tin cans. Taking all of these, and a bottle of water found there as well, Thaddeus felt a prick of conscience. These men had done him no wrong. He scribbled on a piece of paper, "Sorry, I'll give it back when I can," and put the note in a conspicuous place. As he walked away from the farm, a police car appeared on the road, slowly patrolling the area. Thaddeus barely had time to duck into a thicket of blackberries, scratching his face and hands on the thorny branches. The car drove past without noticing him, but it was a reminder of how dangerous his situation was. On the evening of his third day of freedom, sitting by a tiny campfire deep in the woods, Thaddeus was finally able to appreciate the magnitude of his situation. He was an undocumented escaped convict, with minimal resources, hundreds of miles from Fargo, where Kelsey now lived with her new man. Any reasonable person would have recognized the venture as hopeless. But somewhere in the back of his mind, Thaddeus knew he had no other way. He couldn't just let go, forget, resign himself to it. Kelsey had been the only anchor in his life, severed the moment he'd seen her with another man. Now he needed to either re-establish that connection or cut it off permanently, face to face. The choice was clear: Fargo. The distance separating him from his goal seemed insurmountable, 740 miles. But he had no alternatives. Hitchhiking was out of the question. His face was sure to be all over police stations and news reports. Public transportation required papers and money he didn't have. Stealing a car was guaranteed to attract the attention of the authorities. The only option left was to walk. Insane by the standards of the average man. But Thaddeus no longer felt ordinary. 3 years in a cage and his wife's betrayal had erased all boundaries of normality. He spread a map on the ground, torn from an atlas he'd found in the barn. In the firelight, the line from his approximate location to Fargo seemed endless. If he walked 20 miles a day, which was within his ability due to his good physical condition, the journey would take about 37 days. Over a month through mountains, forests, fields, avoiding settlements and roads. A wild, reckless idea. But wasn't it reckless, the very act of trying to get to Kelsey? Wasn't the feeling that drove him forward a mixture of love, hate, and despair insane? On the morning of the 4th day, he began his incredible marathon. He plotted a rough route on a map, avoiding major population centers and highways. His route took him through national parks, rural areas, and sparsely populated neighborhoods. 740 miles to Fargo, to Kelsey, to the truth. And every step, every mile traveled, was going to bring him closer to the finale of this story. The story of a man willing to go through hell for a woman who no longer waited for him. 2 weeks on the road had turned Thaddeus's hands into a map of scars and calluses. The once clean jeans and shirt stolen from the farmer's rope had become dirty and frayed, soaked with the smells of campfire, sweat, and wilderness. His skin, once pale from prison life, was now tanned and calloused by the merciless sun and wind. A baseball cap pulled down over his eyes concealed his stubbled face, the only disguise available to a man on the run. Thaddeus crossed another patch of dense forest somewhere on the Montana-North Dakota border. Here, the pines soared to the sky for dozens of meters, creating an eternal twilight beneath their crowns. The ground underfoot was carpeted with fallen needles, muffling the sound of footsteps. This place, far from human settlements, gave the fugitive a sense of relative safety. Moving through the undergrowth, Thaddeus listened constantly, a habit formed in Afghanistan, where any unusual sound could mean an ambush. Here, in the American wilderness, his enemies were not the Taliban, but his own government, the police of every state and county through which he traveled. He stopped at a small creek to refill his water supply and let his aching muscles get some rest. Kneeling down, Thaddeus scooped up the cool water with the palm of his hand and drank greedily. The surface of the stream mirrored his face for a moment, gaunt and sunken, but with the same stubborn expression that had once attracted Kelsey. The thought of his wife tingled with familiar pain. Kelsey's image hadn't faded in the 2 weeks he'd been traveling. On the contrary, it had become brighter and more haunting. Thaddeus saw her in his dreams, talked to her on the road, mentally rehearsed their meeting that awaited him at the end of this crazy journey. The picture of Kelsey and Javon that he carried in the inside pocket of his shirt, next to his heart, had frayed at the folds to white lines. Thaddeus pulled it out every night when he settled in for the night. It had become a ritual, a reminder of the purpose that pushed him forward when his body refused to obey. Filtering the water through a makeshift filter made from layers of cloth and charcoal, Thaddeus filled his only bottle and rose, surveying his surroundings. There was still at least 10 kilometers to go before darkness fell. His daily route had become almost a ritual. Rising at dawn. A short breakfast of what he had managed to get the day before. Berries, roots, sometimes small fish or rabbit, if he was lucky enough to hunt. Then a march until noon, a short rest in the hottest hours, and on again until sunset. According to his calculations, he covered about 30 kilometers a day, sometimes more if the terrain was favorable. Thaddeus always checked his gear when he rested. The folding knife he had stolen from the barn became his most valuable tool. He used it to forage for food, build shelters, and carve primitive traps for small animals. Flint found on the riverbank allowed him to build a fire. Improvised snares made from rope obtained from an abandoned hunting lodge. Thaddeus continued on his way, skillfully avoiding human settlements. If he had to approach civilization, usually for food or water, he did so at night, like a ghost, leaving no trace. Once, as he made his way along the edge of a small town, he saw a television in the window of a bar. His face flashed on the screen, a news story about an escape. Thaddeus couldn't hear what the reporter was saying, but he realized they were still looking for him. You bet they were. An escaped convict, an ex-Marine with military training. He must be considered armed and dangerous. In a way, they were right. Another night, cautiously approaching a country store on the outskirts of some half-forgotten village, Thaddeus got in through an unlocked restroom window. He took only the essentials, some canned goods, matches, bandages, painkillers. At the cash register, he left half the money he'd stolen from the farm. Not the equivalent, but better than nothing. Overcoming natural obstacles required all the experience he had gained in the service. Mountain streams he crossed by creating makeshift bridges out of fallen trees. He climbed over rocky areas, remembering his mountaineering lessons. When heavy rains turned the trails into a slippery mess, he made a cloak out of a large piece of plastic he found at the dump. But the most difficult challenge was the river, wide and rough, which could not be bypassed. Thaddeus spent the day gathering dry logs and tying them together with vines and ropes to make a primitive raft. The crossing almost cost him his life. The current was stronger than he had expected, and the raft crashed against the rocks in the middle of the river. He had to swim the rest of the way, desperately fighting the water that was trying to pull him into the abyss. Once ashore, Thaddeus lay panting and shivering, exhausted. The knapsack with his supplies was drowned. His knife was miraculously still with him, tied to his belt. His clothes, wet and heavy, clung to his body. At that moment, looking up at the clouds overhead, he wondered for the first time if it was worth it. Was Kelsey worth this crazy marathon, this daily struggle for survival? The answer came by itself when he felt the rectangle of the photo, still securely packed in the waterproof bag in his inside pocket. Yes, she was worth it. Worth it even more. That same evening, while his clothes were still drying by the fire, Thaddeus spotted the lights of a helicopter in the distance. A search operation, perhaps. Though it was unlikely they were still looking for him specifically. More likely, it was just a routine patrol. But instinct made him put out the fire and burrow into the fallen leaves like an animal hiding from a predator. In Fargo, 600 kilometers from where Thaddeus was now hiding, Kelsey Montrose sat in the living room of Javon Price's spacious home, staring blankly at the television screen. The news channel was showing a report on the Vineyard prison breakout, and the picture of Thaddeus in his prison robe was clearly visible on the screen, the sullen face with the stubbornly compressed lips she knew by heart. "You worry too much," Javon said, massaging her tense shoulders. "Even if he escaped, the chances of him getting here are practically nil." Kelsey didn't answer Javon, for all his intelligence and success, didn't know Thaddeus like she didn't realize what he was capable of when he set his mind to it. She'd seen it in Iraq, where she'd flown to meetings with him during his deployment, seen it at Marine boot camp, seen it in their regular lives. "You don't understand," Kelsey finally said. "I know Thad. If he decides to do something, he'll do it. Always. The guy's in jail on the other side of the country," Javon snorted. "Even if he somehow escaped by some miracle and really wants to find you, how the hell is he going to get here? He has no ID, no money, probably doesn't even have civilian clothes. He'll be caught before he crosses the state line." Kelsey shook her head tiredly. Arguing with Javon was useless. He couldn't understand that the usual restrictions that stopped most people were just obstacles for Thaddeus to overcome. Instead of answering, she picked up her cell phone and dialed a number. "Yes, I'd like to speak to someone from the police. It's about the escape from the Vineyard prison. Yes, I saw the report. The fugitive is my husband. We're, in the middle of a divorce." The next morning, they met Detective Isaac Bromley at a cafe near Javon's house. The detective was a tall, dark-skinned man with attentive eyes and quiet manners. That calmness paradoxically heightened Kelsey's anxiety. If the police were taking Thaddeus's escape so seriously that they'd assigned a special detective, then they believed the threat was real. "How well do you know your husband, Mrs. Montrose?" Bromley asked, stirring his coffee. Kelsey grinned. "Better than anyone else, Detective. We've been together 5 years, 3 of which he spent in prison, but that doesn't mean I don't know him. You filed for divorce 2 weeks ago. It wasn't a question. It was a statement." "Yes." Kelsey lowered her eyes. "I met someone else. Life goes on, you know. I couldn't wait forever." "I'm not judging you, Mrs. Montrose," the detective said softly. "I'm just trying to understand what might have triggered your escape. According to our records, your husband had good behavior in prison, and he had less than 2 years left to serve. It doesn't make much sense to risk the extra time." Kelsey clutched her coffee mug so hard her knuckles turned white. "He could have found out about my new relationship. He could have found out about the divorce before the official notice reached him. Prisons have their own information network." Bromley nodded, making a note in his notebook. "How do you think he would have reacted to that news?" Kelsey wondered. Thaddeus had always been passionate, sometimes impulsive, but never aggressive toward her. That incident at the bar had been an exception. He'd defended her, not attacked her. "He would have been devastated," she answered honestly. "Thad is very determined. He was in the Marines when I met him, and that explains a lot about his character. All or nothing, black or white. No halftones. "Do you think he's a threat to you or your new partner?" the detective asked bluntly. Kelsey wanted to automatically say no, but something stopped her. Betrayal, which was how Thaddeus would view her new relationship, and divorce was worse than death to him. She remembered him talking about cheating in his unit, about comrades who trusted their lives to each other. "Yeah, I don't know," she finally said. "In the past, I would have said definitely not. But now, after 3 years in prison, after everything that's happened, I just don't know." Bromley looked at her carefully. "Mrs. Montrose, we know your husband had special training in the Marines, reconnaissance, survival under extreme conditions. That makes him a particularly dangerous and elusive fugitive. You must understand the gravity of the situation." Kelsey felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you suggesting?" "First, we'll put you under surveillance," the detective said. "Second, I'd recommend that you and Mr. Price review the security measures in the house. Third, be on the lookout for anything strange, unusual calls, strangers near your home or work." Upon returning home, Kelsey found Javon in his office at his laptop. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up and smiled, but the smile quickly faded when he saw her worried face. "What's wrong?" he asked, standing up to meet her. "The detective thinks Thaddeus might be trying to get here," she replied. "The police have assigned surveillance and want us to increase security measures." In Detective Isaac Bromley's office, documents related to the Thaddeus Montrose case were spread out on the desk. Army files, reports on his behavior in prison, psychological evaluations made during his trial. Bromley studied each page methodically, trying to build a profile of the man he was about to catch. Thaddeus was no ordinary fugitive. His military training made him a dangerous opponent, and his emotional motivation made him particularly unpredictable. Cheating on his wife, few things could hit a man's psyche harder, especially one imprisoned, stripped of control over his own life. Isaac closed his eyes, trying to imagine Thaddeus's train of thought. What would he do in his place? How would he get from California to North Dakota? Public transportation is out of the question. You need papers. Hitchhiking was too risky. Too many random people, anyone could find out. Steal a car? Maybe, but that would attract attention. Plus, you need gas, and that takes money. A sudden thought made him open his eyes. What if Thaddeus decided to walk? Crazy, of course. 740 miles was no joke. But with his military training, with his obvious motivation, is it possible? Isaac started doing the math. If Thaddeus averages 25 miles a day, no weekends, no stops, it will take him about 30 days to reach Fargo. When you factor in natural obstacles, the need to avoid population centers, and time to get food, it would probably be about 45 days. This meant that if he was traveling on foot, he should be somewhere halfway there by now. The hypothesis seemed so wild that Isaac almost dismissed it. But something made him think about it. He picked up Thaddeus's file and reread the sections concerning his military service. Above average stamina, excellent orienteering skills, high psychological tolerance to stress and physical discomfort, specialized training in field survival. Isaac sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. A crazy theory, but it was worth testing. He dialed the number for the county sheriff's office, located about halfway between Vineyard and Fargo. "Sheriff Donovan, this is Detective Bromley from Fargo. I have an unusual favor to ask of you." 200 kilometers from where Detective Bromley was discussing his theory with the sheriff, Thaddeus Montrose sat in a fallen tree, cutting up mushrooms he had found with his knife. The third week of the journey was the hardest physically and mentally. Feet were covered in calluses that burst and reappeared. His fingernails chipped from constant rock climbing. Insomnia stalked him like a faithful companion. Every rustle in the night could have been a police patrol or a wild animal. But worst of all was the isolation. Thaddeus hadn't spoken to a single person since his escape. Sometimes he caught himself muttering something to himself just to hear a human voice. At times like that, he doubted his own sanity. What is he doing? Why go halfway across America for a woman who chose someone else over him? Wouldn't it have been easier to serve the remaining 2 years and start his life over? Then he'd pull out the picture, and all the questions would go away. It wasn't just about Kelsey anymore. It was about what had been taken from him: freedom, dignity, love, a future. It was about justice, about retribution, about looking into the eyes of the man who stole his wife while he sat in a cage. What would happen when he got to Fargo? Thaddeus didn't know himself. Sometimes he envisioned an emotional reunion with Kelsey, her remorse, their new beginning. Sometimes a violent reprisal against Javon. Most often, just a conversation, an explanation after which he could let go of the past and move on, even if it meant a new prison sentence. The initial rage that had pushed him to escape had gradually transformed into something else, a cold, calculating resolve. Thaddeus was no longer an impulsive fugitive driven by blind rage. He was a hunter, methodical in his pursuit of his goal, mindful of every detail, calculating every step. After eating his meager supper of mushrooms and leftover rabbit meat, Thaddeus spread out the map and marked the next section traveled. Less than 300 miles to go. 2 more weeks of travel, if he was lucky. He folded the map, carefully tucked the photograph into an inside pocket, and lay down, using the backpack as a pillow. Tomorrow, he had a new marathon day waiting for him. New challenges, new miles bringing him closer to Fargo, to Kelsey, to the finale of this crazy story. And with that thought, he fell into a restless sleep in which he ran, but could never reach his destination. On the 42nd day of the journey, Thaddeus finally saw Fargo. The city gradually grew out of the skyline. First, the individual high-rises of the center, then the water tower, then the bridges over the Red River. Standing on a gentle hill near the southern edge, he gazed at the goal of his grueling marathon, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and desolation. His appearance had changed greatly during the 6-week journey. It was hard to recognize the pale prisoner in his weathered, tanned face with the stubble that had grown back. He updated his clothes regularly, making nightly raids on village stores and roadside gas stations. On the 35th day of his trip, a week before Fargo, he'd robbed a small department store in a border town, taking decent jeans, a dark shirt, new boots, and a leather jacket. From the cash register, he took about $300, enough for a last-ditch effort, but not so much as to attract the attention of the feds. Now, on his approach to Fargo, he looked like a regular traveler, tired, but tidy and not suspicious. The first thing Thaddeus did was rent a room in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. For cash, no ID, posing as a trucker whose car had broken down. The owner, an elderly Vietnamese man, just shrugged. He wanted money, not explanations. A hot shower and a clean bed seemed an unacceptable luxury after weeks in the wilderness. For the first time in a long time, Thaddeus allowed himself to fall into a deep, restorative sleep, though even in his sleep, his hand occasionally fumbled for the knife under his pillow. Upon waking, he felt refreshed. His body, hardened by 6 weeks of extreme travel, was ready for the final stage of the mission. After spending an hour shaving and tidying up, Thaddeus set out to explore. At an internet cafe near the motel, he methodically gathered information. Javon Price was a prominent figure in town, owner of 3 restaurants, member of the Chamber of Commerce, sponsor of charity events. His face was often in the local press, a tall, personable man with a confident smile. A successful businessman, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted out of life. Kelsey had been found too. In the photos from the fundraiser, she stood next to Javon, elegant in her evening gown. Looking at those pictures, Thaddeus felt a strange, prick-knot jealousy or anger, but some kind of detached wonder. She looked alien, as if she were not his wife, but a stranger who happened to bear the same name. 3 years in prison and the subsequent escape had created a gulf between them that could not be measured in miles. Continuing his search, Thaddeus found the address of Javon's main restaurant, the Blue Lagoon on Broadway Street. He devoted the next 2 days to surveillance, keeping a safe distance. Javon would usually show up at the restaurant around noon, spend a few hours in his second-floor office, then leave to check out other establishments. He would return in the evening to follow up during peak hours. Following Javon's black Mercedes, Thaddeus found their home, a two-story mansion in an upscale neighborhood. It was surrounded by a small but well-maintained lot with an ornamental fence, more for beauty than protection. It was the typical home of a successful man, confident in his security. 3 times Thaddeus saw Kelsey leave the house, get into a white Lexus, and drive away. Once in the morning, obviously to work, twice in the afternoon, probably for lunch or business. Gradually, Thaddeus's mind formed their routines, and more importantly, the periods when Kelsey was alone in the house. Watching the measured life of his ex-wife and her new man, Thaddeus felt not so much rage as a deep, all-consuming numbness. The emotions that had driven him forward for 6 weeks seemed to have burned out, leaving a void inside. All that remained was a mechanical determination to finish what he had started. On the 4th day of observation, Thaddeus drew up a plan. According to the schedule, Javon would leave home early on Wednesday and return late, after 9 in the evening. Kelsey stayed home most of the time that day. Her car never left the garage. The perfect opportunity to talk to her alone, and then wait for Javon to return. What exactly would happen then? Thaddeus tried not to elaborate. He wanted it to be decided the moment he met, when he looked into the eyes of the man who had ruined his life. The evening before the scheduled date, there was a knock on his motel room door. Thaddeus tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden under his pillow. "Who is it?" he asked, trying to speak calmly. "Fargo police, sir. Routine check. May I come in?" Thaddeus's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly pulled himself together. If they knew who he was, they wouldn't knock politely. It really could have been a routine check. "Just a moment, officer." He glanced around the room hurriedly, removing the knife and marked cards from sight. Then, pulling his baseball cap lower on his forehead, he opened the door. A middle-aged policeman with a tired face stood on the threshold. "Sorry to bother you, sir. We're checking all the motels in the area. We're looking for a suspect in a string of burglaries. Have you noticed anything unusual?" "No, officer," Thaddeus replied calmly, keeping a low profile. "I've only been here a couple days, waiting for my truck to be fixed." The policeman nodded, clearly not interested. "If you notice anything, call this number." He held out a business card and walked to the next door. Thaddeus closed the door, feeling his heart pounding. Close contact with the police was dangerous. Perhaps it was worth speeding up the plan. Tomorrow. It would all be over tomorrow. As Thaddeus prepared for the crucial day, Detective Isaac Bromley sat in his office, studying the map spread out on his desk. On it were marked the points of possible sightings of Thaddeus Montrose, disparate reports that, however, added up to an alarmingly straight line from Vineyard to Fargo. When Bromley first floated the theory that the fugitive might be on foot, colleagues only laughed, but he insisted on testing it. Contacting sheriffs in the counties between Vineyard and Fargo, he requested information on unusual thefts, strange encounters with unknown persons, any anomalies. The data proved fragmented but alarming. A gas station robbery in Montana, a theft from a country store in North Dakota, a department store robbery the week before, where the perpetrator took an odd assortment of items, clothes, shoes, necessities. And finally, 3 days ago, a call from a roadside cafe owner who saw a man matching Thaddeus's description near Fargo. If his calculations are correct, Montrose is in town or very close, and no doubt heading toward Kelsey. Bromley picked up the phone. "Mrs. Montrose? This is Detective Bromley. I need to see you and Mr. Price right away, tonight, if possible." An hour later, Bromley was sitting in the spacious living room of Price's house. Kelsey looked worried. Javon looked rather annoyed. "I have reason to believe your husband is in Fargo," the detective said without preamble. Kelsey went pale. Javan snorted. This theory again? Look, detective, with all due respect, it sounds ridiculous. How could a man with no money, no ID, no transportation travel that distance? Bromley put a folder on the table with the data he'd collected. On foot, Mr. Price, alone, through forests and fields, surviving with skills learned in the Marines and committing petty thefts for sustenance. Here is evidence of his journey. He laid out photos and reports. This is no longer theory. It's a fact. And if I'm right, Montrose is already here, getting ready to meet you. Kelsey squeezed Javan's hand as she looked through the documents. This does sound like Thad. I always said that if he made up his mind about something, he'd do it. Javan, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, asked, What do you suggest? Move to a safe place temporarily. We can arrange for police protection. I will not run from this man, Javan said firmly. This is my home. I have security at the restaurant. I can get private security here. Javan, please, Kelsey pleaded. You don't know Thaddeus, and you don't know me if you think I'm going to hide. He cut him off. Bromley sighed. In that case, I insist on 24-hour police surveillance, and you both should be extremely careful, especially tomorrow. Why tomorrow? Kelsey asked. Wednesday, according to your schedule, you're usually home alone while Mr. Price works, the detective explained. It would be the perfect time to try to talk to you. Kelsey flinched. Javan put his arm around her shoulders. I'll stay home tomorrow. I don't think that's a good idea, Bromley objected. If Montrose wants to meet with your wife alone and finds you, the situation could escalate. Better let us set up surveillance and intervene at the right moment. The next morning, on the appointed day, Thaddeus awoke at dawn. For the first time in 6 weeks, he had no intention of going anywhere. Today, his journey was going to end. He checked his equipment, a knife with a 7-inch blade bought at a department store, a coil of strong cord, a flashlight, a bottle of water. He dressed inconspicuously, dark jeans, black shirt, jacket. Nothing flashy, memorable. At 9:30 in the morning, Thaddeus took up a position in the park across from Price's house. From here, he had a good view of the garage driveway and the main entrance. At 10, he saw Javan's black Mercedes pull into the driveway and head toward the center. But contrary to expectations, Kelsey's white Lexus stayed in the garage. 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. 2 police officers got out and took up a position outside the house. Then a dark sedan appeared, from which a man in civilian clothes, Detective Bromley, got out. They were obviously expecting him today. Thaddeus retreated deeper into the park, contemplating the situation. The police had guessed his presence and were preparing to meet him. But if Kelsey was home and protected, Javan was probably at the restaurant. There might be security there too, but not as tight as here. The solution came naturally. If they couldn't catch Javan at home, then they'd have to meet him at the Blue Lagoon. Moving downtown, Thaddeus watched the restaurant from across the street. Strangely, there were no police around. Perhaps they were focusing their forces on protecting the house, underestimating his resolve. All day he had waited patiently, shifting positions so as not to attract attention. The restaurant was busy, a lunchtime flow, then a brief lull, then the evening rush of customers. Javan appeared in the room several times, chatting with the guests, then returned to his office. At 9 p.m., the main flow of visitors subsided. Thaddeus saw the last waiters leaving the restaurant through the service entrance. Inside, judging by the light in the second-floor windows, only Javan and maybe a couple of employees remained. Thaddeus walked around the building and entered through the unlocked service door. The kitchen was empty. The cooks had already left, leaving everything cleanly scrubbed and ready for tomorrow. He silently climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the owner's office was located. The office door was ajar. Javan sat at his desk, immersed in his paperwork. He didn't notice Thaddeus enter and quietly shut the door behind him. "Javan Price," Thaddeus said, and the businessman flinched, raising his eyes from the papers. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" he asked, clearly not recognizing the man in front of him. "I'm Thaddeus Montrose," he answered, watching Javon's eyes widen as understanding and fear flickered across his face. Kelsey's husband. Javon stood up slowly, not taking his eyes off the intruder. The police are looking all over town for you. They know you're here. Yeah, I noticed. Thaddeus nodded, locking the door. They're guarding the house, but there's no one here to protect you. Javon glanced at the phone on the table. What do you want? Justice, Thaddeus answered, pulling a knife from his pocket. You stole my wife while I was in jail for defending her. 3 years is a long time, isn't it? If she really loved me, she would have waited. Look. Javon tried to speak calmly, but his voice betrayed him. We didn't plan this. It just happened. Kelsey was lonely. Lonely? Thaddeus interrupted, stepping forward. She had a husband. I wrote her every week. I was counting the days until she was released. Montrose, let's talk. Javon backed away slowly until his back was against the wall. Kelsey loves me. She chose me. What do you hope to gain by killing me? Her love? Her gratitude? No. Thaddeus shook his head. Just justice. The movement was swift, honed by years of military training. The knife went under Javon's ribs, striking the heart. The restaurateur's eyes widened with shock and pain. He tried to say something, but only a wheeze escaped his throat. Thaddeus supported his slumping body, gently laying him on the floor. It's nothing personal, he said quietly, looking into the glassy eyes. It's just that no one dares to take what is mine. Wiping the knife on Javon's shirt, Thaddeus tucked it back into his pocket. Now that left Kelsey. He must see her face when she learned of her lover's death. Must look into the eyes of the woman he'd traveled 740 miles to do justice for. Leaving the office, Thaddeus walked down the stairs and left the restaurant through the same service door. The night air was cool and fresh after the stuffy room. He inhaled deeply, feeling strangely calm. One part of his mission was complete. The second remained. Price's house was a 15-minute walk away. Thaddeus moved confidently, not hiding. It didn't matter now if he was seen. The deed was done, and he wasn't going to run away. 7 weeks ago, he had escaped from prison, driven by a thirst for revenge. Now that his revenge was done, there was nowhere to go, and no reason to run. The police car was still parked outside the house, but the officer seemed to be dozing at the wheel. The second policeman and detective were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps they were patrolling the perimeter or had changed to another car. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. Thaddeus walked to the front door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, a light came on in the hallway and the door opened. Kelsey stood before him, so familiar and so foreign at the same time. Tad? Her voice trembled, her eyes widened with recognition and fear. Hello, Kelsey, Thaddeus said quietly. May I come in? Before she could answer, there was a sharp shout from behind her. Police! Don't move! Thaddeus turned slowly. Detective Bromley was standing a few feet away, pointing a gun at his chest. Hands behind your head, Montrose. Slowly. Thaddeus looked at Kelsey, then at the detective. He could have rushed into the house, grabbed Kelsey, used her as a shield. He could have tried to escape, lost himself in the night. But why? His journey ended here, at the doorstep of the house that should have been his home, a home that would never be home to his wife. Javon is dead, he said, raising his hands. I killed him in the restaurant. The body is in his office. Kelsey cried out, covering her mouth with her hands, her face contorted with horror and grief. Why, Thad? Why? She whispered through her tears. Because you were mine, he answered simply. And he took you away. Detective Bromley approached, pulling out his handcuffs. Thaddeus Montrose, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent. Thaddeus wasn't listening. He stared at Kelsey, trying to memorize every feature of her face. The woman he'd killed a man in a bar for. The woman he'd escaped from prison for. The woman he'd walked 740 miles for. the woman who never loved him the way he loved her. 3 months later, the court sentenced Thaddeus Montrose to life in prison without parole. The story of the prisoner who traveled 740 miles on foot to kill his wife's lover made a splash in the press. Some saw it as a romantic tragedy, others as an example of dangerous obsession. Kelsey didn't show up for her trial.